lost comms with Alpha 2 hours ago. I need you to follow their trail to Station 326. Find out what's going on.
Alright, so what we were just looking at was a video of the gameplay of a new horror mission that I kind of put together. It's very short, but it's meant just to showcase a new script that I've been working on. And if you're not familiar with Arma 3, this right here that we're looking at is the Arma 3 editor. And this is basically what a mission can look like, kind of. But it allows you to make your own scenarios, and if you dive a little deeper into Arma 3, you can even write script code. And this is some of the code that's involved in making that horror element happen. And we're going to talk a little bit more in depth on how that works. So in the beginning of the mission, you start off in this truck and you make your way down the road, and our objective is to find these group of missing soldiers who went into this wooded area here, this little forest, and they disappeared. So it's very simple and straightforward, but it's meant to kind of just put us in contact with these scary entities that we're meant to fight. Because in Arma 3 you can grab assets like this truck, and I can grab the passenger out of the truck and move him around. It's actually pretty intuitive, it works really well. And so we start off, and this truck right here has a driver, and the driver actually, if you see this black line coming off of him, he has different waypoints, and his first waypoint is going to take him down this road. You can see it a little better now. He's meant to just drive here, and then when he drops me off, or you as the player, once you get dropped off, he just kind of goes away because we don't really need him anymore as an actor in this scene or a scenario. So he's just going to drive away. But there are these blue things that you see here are triggers, and they help us kind of guide the scenario along. As the truck starts driving down the road, we're going to hit this first trigger right here, and what it's going to do is it's going to use a command called say 3D, and basically we're going to feed it a custom audio that we've recorded. So car 1 obviously is the car, and that's actually where the sound is going to emit from. But what that's going to do is it's going to trigger that custom sound, and the custom sound is just something I recorded in Audacity, and you turn it into a .ogg format file, and it will allow it to be played by the game engine. And basically I just recorded myself saying, hey, go look for this group and figure out what's going on. Very simple stuff. And so we'll work our way down the road here, and as we go down the road, we're going to reach our first spot here. We're going to hit another trigger, which will give us some title text. And so these are some of the very easy things you can do with scripting. And the title text, it's just going to pop up on the screen and tell us to follow the blue chem lights. As you can see, there's like a square box here. There's a very defined area. And once your character enters this area, it's pretty obvious that it will activate the trigger. Moving forward, we have another trigger here that will actually start playing some music for us just to kind of set the mood. And this next one it'll activate the next waypoint for the truck, and it'll get him moving forward down the road. So he'll wait until we start moving out here, and then once we get to this point, the truck will just go ahead and leave us. And that's meant to kind of give a sense of aloneness, kind of. And you know, if you make your players feel alone when they're in a dark setting like this, it helps to kind of set the mood of horror, or you know, make it kind of scary. This next trigger is just going to give us some more title text. No big deal there. Here we have an invisible helipad. This is a little more complex trick that I like to use, but the music will actually be emitted from this invisible object. And so when I start playing the music, what it'll do is it'll take this invisible object and kind of attach it to the player's feet, per se. You can kind of imagine it that way. And it will the music will actually follow the player until we reach this area. Once we reach over here, it will actually drop this helipad over here. Don't worry that it's a helipad. It's just a kind of invisible object. It doesn't matter like there's other objects you can use that are invisible. This is just my go-to. But it will actually drop this here so that when you walk away, if you notice, the music will kind of fade. It's just a little trick I like to use. Let's go ahead and put this back where we found it. Pop that over there. Got some chem lights on the ground. That's another cool thing about the Eden editor is you can place these objects. I can actually move these props around and you know, put them, kind of set up the scene and make it look however you want, which is really cool. Right here, I've got a little notepad with a custom texture. So this is something I just made in Photoshop. So you can just make this, and I can actually set the texture to this notepad to display what I want it to. And you know, I've written in blood like they are watching. It's just kind of a spooky thing, and it fits the horror, the enemies that we're about to face, because they're literally like floating red eyes in the woods. And I always thought that was kind of spooky, and you know, they kind of watch you, and they also disappear. They follow you around. They pop up behind you. It's a pretty neat thing. So this is very appropriate for the scene. Another thing we'll look at real quick is if we double click on here. This is our custom texture down here. Pretty easy to pop those in. If you have a custom .jpg, you can pop it in here in the texture field. And it actually has an add action. So an add action is kind of whenever you're in the game, you'll have an option that pops up that allows you to interact with in-game objects. And this add action is actually just going to give us some information. It's just going to say exactly what the pad says. So it's just a little extra clue for the player to kind of get a feel of what's going on. As well as this, we got some title text here that's going to tell you to turn on your flashlight so that you can see the blood on the ground, because you can't see the red when it's all dark. So as soon as you turn on your flashlight, you see that blood, and you know, that's meant to kind of scare the player a little bit. So everything else past here is kind of straightforward. This is just this area on your way to your destination. Basically, it's just going to spawn the enemies, and the enemy are those floating eyes, those entities in the dark that they kind of hunt you, and if you don't get away from them or fight them, which it's very hard to run from them, you're probably going to need a vehicle or something to go fast enough to run away from these things. So you're going to need to shoot at them, and if you don't, they will hurt you, and every time they hit you, it takes a good amount of health, and you'll notice that they start making noise when they're nearby. And once that noise peaks, it will hurt you and kind of disorient you for a moment, and you can only handle like 3 or 4 of those hits and then you're dead. So you need to get out of there for sure. So right here, here's another trigger, and what it's going to do is it's going to execute the eyes.sqf. And now these other trigger points right here, they actually will run that same code, and basically they're just spawning more. So each time you run that code, it spawns 1 of those entities that will follow you. And so if you try to run away from them, you're going to encounter more. So it's actually better to try to stay and fight them one at a time. But you know, you don't know that going into this scenario at first. So I would assume most players would just kind of try to haul ass and try to run away from these entities, and as you start triggering more of them, next thing you know, you're surrounded by 3 or 4 of these things, and that is a death sentence for the player dead. I mean, pretty much. Okay, so now that we've kind of looked at how the layout of the mission works in the editor, let's go behind the scenes a little bit and talk about the code some. And the code is pretty interesting. We'll get a little deep into it. I'm going to explain it the best I can for those who do or don't understand how .sqf works. We're going to skim through it and just talk basically about how this works. So we've got our eyes.sqf here, and yeah, let's get right into it. So first things first, the way this is going to work is we're just going to spawn our creature. And now the entity is just made up of these spheres. So it's just a little 10-centimeter sphere, a blood splatter that's on the ground, and we have these 2 spheres that kind of, they attach to it and float above it. And we're actually going to be moving around this blood splatter object. So blood 1, you'll see it here, that's the name for that object. And we're going to move that object around, and since the eyes, the little red eyes, are attached to it, they're just going to kind of follow wherever we move this blood object. So just remember that moving forward. Right here, without going into too much detail, this section here, we're just kind of creating a particle effect, and you'll see there's like a little black misty orb that accompanies the red eyes. It's meant to just give it a little bit more volume. That's kind of a work in progress, but at the same time, it works well, and it's just kind of a see-through black mist. So don't worry about that, but that's what that's doing right there. Now we are setting, you will see a couple times we're going to use set object texture global. Now this right here, we're just going to be changing the color and the transparency of the red eyes, and also we're going to be changing the, right here where it says set object scale, we're just changing the size. We've got to make the eyes a little bit smaller, and right here attached to, we're attaching them to that blood object, and we're telling them what kind of offset we want them to be. So they're going to be like 1.5 meters in the air, and you know, we're going to offset them from each other a little, so they're kind of set in the right spot. Now, let's not go too deep into here, but right here we have event handlers. Now, event handlers are pretty cool in Arma. They just let you fire and trigger certain code whenever certain events happen in the game. So it's pretty straightforward. So fired near and fired, you can assume that this will actually trigger code whenever a weapon is fired or a weapon is fired near a certain object. So this code right here is actually going to handle us shooting at these entities. So whenever you shoot at one of the floating eye entities, I'm not sure what to call them yet. So whenever you shoot at the eyes, we'll call them the eyes. What it's going to do is it's just going to do a little bit of calculations, Let's back this up just a little. Yeah, so right here, what we're doing is we got to do a little calculation of where the bullet goes. So we actually will track the projectile that comes out of the player's weapon, and we're going to track the object, which will be just one of the floating eyes. And so you never actually kill these entities. The bullet doesn't actually collide with the red eyes or anything like that. We're actually just kind of scaring them away. So even with the code, when the bullet gets close enough to them, they just kind of disappear. You're actually just kind of scaring them away because there's no killing these things. Fighting them, shooting at them, you are in a sense fighting them, but it's kind of fruitless since they will kind of go away, but they're not dying. They won't actually take damage and die. So this code's kind of interesting in that way. It'll actually just kind of calculate how close the projectile is to the eye, and if it gets close enough, it will delete the eye entity. It'll get rid of it. It'll make it kind of go away, which is cool because it actually tracks the projectile for a couple seconds throughout its flight time. It'll track the projectile. So even if you're shooting from a further distance. Now, the further away you are from the eye, the harder it is to kill it because of how the code actually works. The closer you are, the quicker it will actually detect that the projectile is close to it and get rid of it for you. Which, it's not the perfect way to do it, but honestly, for me, the way it ended up working in practice, I think worked for the feel of the script and how the entities kind of work. So it worked out for me, especially when you can't make those objects take damage in that way. So for me, I think it works. The next thing we're going to look at is how the eyes damage the player. But one thing it will do is it kind of sets a timer, and it will play that kind of grudge sound pretty much while the entity is alive. While, if you haven't shot at it and scared it away, it's going to play that sound, and it's going to wait for about 35 seconds. So if that eye entity exists for more than 35 seconds and you haven't shot at it and scared it away yet, what it's going to do is it's going to pick up anybody who's nearby and it's going to damage them. So it's going to see what your health is, and it's going to add some damage to your health and set it. So it's going to hurt you, is what it does right here. And then it's going to play another sound, and this sound right here is just like a pain sound. So you're just going to like grunt and make a sound that you're in pain, and it's going to add that camera shake. So it's going to, kind of simulate it kind of hurting you in some way. Okay, so moving on, we've got the next section here, and this is just going to be a short little section that handles the flashlight flickering, and that's actually kind of a neat effect in my opinion, having the eye entity mess with your electronics, and whenever your flashlight kind of flickers in the dark, it adds a sense of desperation and, kind of, when that light goes out, you feel pretty alone and you start getting a little desperate, and that's usually what drives players to start running away. And with this, in this situation with these entities, when you start running, that's when you're gonna die. You actually have to stand your ground and try to fight these things, because if you run, you will die. And I think that's a kind of a cool part of it. Psychologically, that's what this script is meant to kind of mess with you psychologically. So while the entity is alive, once again, it's gonna check who is nearby, so near entities, and then we're gonna filter that for soldiers, units, So anybody who's within 100 meters, it's going to check your current weapon, and it's going to check if your flashlight is on. Because if you're not using your flashlight at the moment, then it needs to kind of skip this code, because we don't want to run code that's not necessary. So what it's going to do is it's going to pick a random number between 1 and 10, and that's going to be how many times it actually flickers on and off. And then down here, it's going to turn the light off, and it's going to wait for like 1 to 3 milliseconds, and then it's going to turn the light back on, and then it's going to loop. So this will loop 1 to 10 times. So every time it loops, it'll turn it off and then turn it back on, and it's going to run through that really quickly, and that's what actually makes your gun light flicker. So it's going to flicker right here, and then it's going to wait anywhere from 10 to 30 seconds. So every 10 to 30 seconds, your light will flicker as long as that eye entity is alive and chasing you around. So in a nutshell, that's kind of how that works. Last but not least, kind of the main section. So all the parts above that we just talked about, those were parts that I kind of added on. And this is the base of the code that kind of makes them follow you around and stuff. While that entity is alive, it is going to check its distance to the player. So how far away, the eye is. And remember, the blood one is an object that is it's all the eyes and shit are kind of attached to. So think of that as the base. And so it's going to see how close it is to the player. And so right here, it's going to make a little check that's going to help us make it kind of disappear and pop back up if you get too close to it. Because I noticed that during testing, if you get too close to the floating eyes, it kind of kills the immersion a little bit if you're running right up on it. Because you could, you're always going to have those kind of players who don't run away from things. They will run right at kind of creepy stuff because there's some desensitized or immune to that in some way. But if you get too close, so if your distance to the eye entity is less than 10 meters, then it will run this code right here. Now blink is just, it's going to make the eyes kind of close, and it's going to disappear and pop up somewhere else. So yeah, but when that happens, when the blink value gets to 25, or if you're too close to it, it's going to go ahead and push the blink value all the way to 25. Once that value is to that point, what it's going to do is right here where it says set texture, it says the same thing a couple times in a row, but basically what it's going to do is right here where it says 0.9, that's the color. So it's in RGB format, so red, green, blue, and the one right there is the alpha, the transparency of the object. So we're actually going to change the color. So if we turn, right now it's usually set to 1 right here, and if it's just RGB, so red, green, and blue, if it's 1, 0, 0, it's red, because red is 1, green, there's no green and there's no blue. So if we start setting this red number down, it's going to start turning black. And for these objects, black is kind of transparent. So every 0.1 seconds, it's going to set that transparency down to 0.7, 0.6, 0.5, 0.4. Now, changing the texture like this, I could do it with like a loop and make it a little more efficient. But right now, for me, like I had some trouble making a loop happen when it comes to these textures. It's a little complicated in the engine. I'm sure I'm going to find a way around that to optimize this into like just kind of a simple loop. But for now, it will actually, we're just going to run this code a couple times until we get all the way down to 0 and it's transparent. So most of the time you would run that in kind of a neat and clean loop, but that's coming when we optimize the code a little bit in the future. So it's going to kind of make those eyes disappear, and then what we're going to do is we're going to right here where it says get direction, or get dir, that means to get direction, and we're also going to get the position of the player. So basically what we're doing is we're getting the direction of the eyes versus the player, like what direction they should be looking, and then we're going to get a new random position nearby the player. So it's going to be anywhere from 10 to 12 meters from the player, and it's going to, right here where it says set position, that's basically teleport. So we're going to teleport the eyes to a new position near the player, and the way I've got this code set up, it will pretty much spawn behind you typically. So wherever you're facing or wherever they were before, they will kind of pop up behind the player. So they will follow you around no matter where you run. Once they blink out, and they disappear, they will teleport somewhere kind of behind you. And then anywhere you see sleep, if you're confused about that, sleep just kind of suspends the code. It helps us with the timing of how the code is executed, and helps us run things at the right time when we need it. So don't worry about that too much. And then we're just going to set the texture again. So as soon as it teleports behind the player, you'll notice that this number right here, where the red value goes back up to 1. So it will become visible once again. So technically it doesn't despawn when this happens. It actually just turns invisible and will teleport behind the player and then become visible again, so you can see those eyes in the dark. One good thing about those sphere objects that we're using, they actually do kind of glow in the dark. So they emit light in the dark, which is really useful for code like this. This code, if we remember, this code only happens whenever the blink value gets to 25. So we're actually running a loop, and this code that we just looked at, it doesn't run all the time. It only runs, let's see, it kind of runs randomly. So every time we come down here, it's going to add 1 to 5 points to the blink value, and so every 1 second it runs through this code and it will add this blink value to it. So anywhere from 5 to 25 seconds, the blink value will reach 25 or above, and it will make the eyes close. It goes invisible, teleports behind the player, and then becomes visible again. So every 5 to 25 seconds is the range in which that will happen. But since it adds between 1 and 5 blink points to the blink value every 1 second, that becomes pretty random. So I think it'd be pretty typical for them to teleport behind you every 10, 12, 15 seconds or so. Somewhere in the middle is probably a pretty common amount for that to happen. Right here, we'll notice that this right here, set direction, we're actually just using this little bit of code right here to make sure that the eyes will actually face the player at all times. So wherever you move, if you're running a circle around the floating eyes, they will follow you and actually track you and make sure that they're looking at you all the time, which is a pretty creepy addition to the code. This extra little bit of code right here, in a nutshell, what this little bit does is it just kind of makes the eyes flicker a little so that they're not a constant, like really bright tone of red. They'll actually kind of like dim for a random amount of time, and it gives it kind of a fluctuating, kind of more of a live feel. Okay, and then further down to kind of in the code, we do have our blink value that we talked about, but at the very end, if we break out, so this is a while loop, so while the entity is alive, it will run the code above and it will continue to loop. It won't actually reach this point until you scare it away. once it breaks out of that code above, it will actually delete the blood object that is the base, both of the eyes, and remember PS1 is just that kind of smoky, transparent ore. Then it's going to do a kind of interesting part here. It's going to pick a random number between 0 and 10, and if that number is greater than 6, then it will spawn this whole code again. So imagine what it's doing is you shoot at it and you scare it away, so it deletes that one, and then the way it's set up where it says 0, 10, and 0, it's got a min, mid, and max for which number it's choosing. What this is doing is it's giving it about a 25, on average, it's about a 25% chance that it's going to pop back up. So you shoot at it, it gets scared away, but it can come back. So there's a 25% chance, more or less, that it will continue to haunt you. It'll just kind of reset itself. And when it first spawns, it spawns further away from you. So if you shoot at it and you get it to kind of fuck off, it will get it gains you as the player a little bit of distance from the eye entity, and it kind of restarts its ability to hurt you. So you have to keep continuing to fire at it and keep trying to scare it away until you win this kind of dice roll here. And this is the dice roll of you actually getting rid of it and it leaving you alone. So this could happen the first time that you scare it away, or it could just keep popping up a random number of times. There's, you could be very unlucky and it continue to pop up like 10 different times. So there's that random chance right there of the eyes continuing to haunt you. That concludes the video, and I hope everybody kind of gets a kick out of a little bit of behind the scenes of how this stuff works and what's going on when it comes to mission making in Arma 3 and what goes into it.